Welcome back to History for Sleep. Find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let history carry you gently into the night. There is nowhere you need to be now, nothing you need to hold on to from the day that has passed. Let the weight of your body settle into the surface beneath you and allow your breath to find its own quiet rhythm, slow and steady, like waves retreating from a distant shore. Before we begin our journey, let the world around you soften and fade. Imagine now a vast and ancient ocean, not any ocean you can name, but an ocean that existed before names were ever spoken. Its waters stretch in every direction, dark and silver under a sky thick with stars. There is no land in sight, no ship, no distant light, only the slow, endless breathing of the sea as it rises and falls beneath the pull of a moon that has watched over this world for billions of years. The surface of the water is not still but gently moving, long, low swells that roll forward as if the ocean itself is dreaming. Listen to the sound of those swells, not crashing, not breaking, just a deep, rhythmic hush, a whisper of water against water, a sound that has been playing since long before there were ears to hear it, and beneath that sound, a deeper silence still. The silence of depths no sunlight has ever touched, the silence of mountains hidden under miles of blue darkness, the silence of valleys that were once dry land, once walked upon, once filled with voices and footsteps and the warmth of living things. Feel the temperature of this place. The air is cool but not cold, carrying the faint taste of salt and the smell of distant rain. A breeze moves across the water, slow and unhurried, touching your skin like the softest breath. It has travelled far, this breeze. It has passed over islands that no map has ever recorded. It has drifted through forests that grew and fell before human eyes ever opened. It carries with it the memory of places that have long since returned to the sea. Look now toward the horizon, that thin, blurred line where the dark water meets the darker sky. There is something there, something almost visible, a shape, a shadow. Perhaps it is an island, low and green, its hills rounded by millennia of wind and rain. Perhaps it is a coastline, the edge of a continent that once rose proud above the waves and now lies submerged in silence. Or perhaps it is only a cloud, a trick of the fading light. In this place between waking and sleep, it does not matter which it is. What matters is the feeling it stirs in you, the sense that something ancient and beautiful once existed just beyond the reach of memory. You are drifting now, carried by currents older than civilization itself. The water below you is deep, so deep that the light from the stars fades long before it reaches the seafloor. Down there, in the cold and the stillness, lies a world that was once alive, stone foundations of buildings that have not felt the sun for 10,000 years, roads that once connected villages and temples, now covered in silt and coral, the bones of ships that sailed confidently across waters they thought they knew, now resting in permanent twilight. Gardens that bloomed with flowers whose names are forgotten, marketplaces where people laughed and argued and loved, now silent except for the occasional drift of a deep-sea current passing through empty windows and doorways. And above, on the surface where we drift, the moonlight paints a path across the swells, a road of silver that seems to lead directly into the heart of the unknown. This is the road we will travel tonight, not with our bodies, which are resting peacefully, but with our minds, which are free to wander through the lost landscapes of history and myth. We will visit islands that glowed with the light of lanterns and torches. We will walk through cities whose names became legends. We will listen to stories passed down through countless generations, stories of great civilizations that rose, flourished, and then quietly, mysteriously, slipped beneath the waves. Some of these stories are built on memory, some on imagination, some on fragments of truth so old that they have been worn smooth like sea glass, their sharp edges softened by centuries of retelling. Tonight we will hold all of them gently. We will not demand proof, and we will not seek to separate fact from fable. We will simply listen, as one listens to the wind or the rain, allowing the stories to wash over us and carry us where they will. Think now of all the people who have stood on shorelines throughout history, looking out at the same vast waters and wondering what lay beyond. Think of the sailors who set out with only the stars to guide them, their hearts full of hope and fear. Think of the elders who sat by fires and told the young ones about the great flood, the great island, the great kingdom that the sea had claimed. Think of the scholars who pored over ancient texts by candlelight, tracing the same words again and again, trying to unlock secrets that seemed to hover just beyond their understanding. All of them, the sailors, the elders, the scholars, were reaching toward the same thing, the same feeling you have now, the sense that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we can ever fully comprehend. The oceans of our planet hold their secrets close. They have swallowed coastlines and river valleys and entire land masses. They have covered over the evidence of human lives and human settlements with a blanket of blue so complete that we can only guess at what lies beneath. But the water also preserves. It holds structures in its cold embrace, protecting them from wind and sun and the erosion of time. Down there, in the deep, a stone carved by human hands 10,000 years ago might still bear the marks of the tool that shaped it. A piece of pottery might still show the fingerprint of the potter who pressed it into shape. A wall might still stand, leaning slightly, waiting for light that will never return. And so we drift through the night and through the water, toward the first of the lost worlds that await us. The air grows warmer now, softer, scented with something floral, jasmine perhaps, or the sweet fragrance of blossoms that open only in darkness. The sound of the sea has become even gentler, a rhythmic lapping against unseen shores. In the distance, very faint, almost imagined, there is music. Not a melody you could hum, but a resonance, a vibration, as if the earth itself is singing a song too low for waking ears to perceive. This is the threshold, the place between what we know and what we dream. The stories are waiting. The lost civilizations are stirring in their long sleep. The waters are parting just enough to let us pass through into the world of memory and myth. Take one more deep, slow breath. Let your shoulders drop a little further. Let the last threads of the day's thoughts unravel and drift away like mist over the morning sea. There is nothing to hold on to. There is only the journey ahead and the quiet and the night. We begin where all stories of lost lands begin, with the sea itself, and with the oldest question humanity has ever asked the horizon. What lies beyond the water's edge, and what lies beneath? The sea has always been the keeper of secrets. Long before humans built their first cities, long before they learned to write or to work metal, the oceans were already ancient, vast bodies of water that had witnessed the slow drift of continents, the rise and fall of mountain ranges, and the quiet passage of millions of years. When the first humans walked to the edge of a shoreline and looked out across the water, they must have felt something we can still recognize today, a mixture of wonder and longing, and a strange quiet sadness. The sea was beautiful, and it was endless, and it hid things from them. It always would. In those early days, the world was a different shape. The ice held so much water locked away in glaciers and ice sheets that the seas were lower, sometimes hundreds of feet lower, and coastlines extended far beyond where they lie today. There were plains where now there are fishing grounds. There were forests where now there are coral reefs. There were rivers that ran through valleys that have since become underwater canyons. People lived in those places. They built homes and raised children and buried their dead. They told stories about the world as they knew it, and their world was, in some ways, larger than ours, or at least more mysterious, because they could walk to the edge of their land and look out at the water and know with absolute certainty that something lay beyond, something they could not see, something that might be wonderful or terrible or both. And when the ice began to melt, slowly at first, then faster, the waters rose. Year by year, generation by generation, the sea crept inland. It swallowed marshes and floodplains. It turned hills into islands. It covered pathways that had been walked for centuries. People must have watched this happen. They must have seen the water rising and understood, in a way that is hard for us to fully grasp, that their world was shrinking, that the places where their ancestors had lived were disappearing beneath the waves, that the landmarks they had used for navigation, the sacred sites they had visited for ceremonies, the graves of their beloved dead, all of it was being taken by the sea. And so the stories began, stories of great floods, stories of lands that had sunk beneath the water, stories of civilizations that had angered the gods or the spirits and been punished with destruction. These stories appear in cultures all over the world. They are among the oldest narratives humans have ever told. The Mesopotamians told of a great deluge. The Hebrews told of Noah. The Greeks told of Deucalion. The Hindus told of Manu. The Maya told of a flood that ended the previous age of the world. And in every story, there was loss. There was a world that existed before, a world that was different from the one the storytellers knew, a world that was gone forever. What if some of these stories were not just myths? What if they were memories distorted by time and retelling, but memories nonetheless, of real events, real places, real losses? This is the question that has haunted the human imagination for as long as there have been humans to imagine. It is the question that gave birth to the legends of Atlantis and Lemuria and Mu and all the other lost civilizations that we will explore together tonight. It is a question that sits at the boundary between history and myth, between evidence and intuition, between what we can prove and what we can feel. Let us drift now over some of those drowned landscapes. Picture the North Sea not as it is today, a grey, cold expanse of water between Britain and mainland Europe, but as it was 12,000 years ago. In those times, the sea level was so low that Britain was not an island at all. A vast lowland stretched from the white cliffs of Dover to the marshes of what is now the Netherlands. This was Doggerland, a rich and fertile region of marshes, rivers, lakes and forests. It was home to deer and wild boar, to birds and fish and all the life that thrives in a temperate wetland. And it was home to people, hunter-gatherers who moved through the seasons, following the migrations of animals, camping by rivers, living lives that were in many ways similar to the lives their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. They left traces behind, stone tools, bone fragments, the remnants of their fires. And then the waters rose and Doggerland began to shrink. The people moved to higher ground. Within a few thousand years, the entire region was underwater. What was once a homeland became the floor of a cold sea. Now picture a different ocean. On the other side of the world, the South China Sea and the Java Sea, the waters around Indonesia and Malaysia and Vietnam. During the last ice age, these waters were so low that a vast peninsula extended from the Asian mainland, a region scientists now call Sundaland. It was nearly the size of India. It was covered in tropical forests and crossed by rivers. It was home to elephants and tigers and rhinoceros, and to human communities who fished in its waters and hunted in its forests and traded with one another along its coasts. And then, as the ice melted, the waters rose. Sundaland became a collection of islands. Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the lowlands between them were lost. The people who lived there had to adapt or migrate. Some of their stories might have survived, passed down through countless generations, transformed into legends of kingdoms beneath the sea. And there are other lost landscapes too. Off the coast of India, where the waters of the Indian Ocean cover continental shelves that were once exposed. Off the coast of Florida, where ancient shorelines lie deep beneath the Gulf of Mexico. Off the coast of Japan, where underwater structures hint at human presence during times of lower sea levels. In the Mediterranean, where the rising waters at the end of the Ice Age flooded coastal plains and created the islands we know today. In the Black Sea, where a catastrophic flood may have turned a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea in a matter of months or years, drowning settlements and farmlands and changing the lives of everyone who survived. All of these places have something in common. They are real. Geologists and archaeologists have studied them and mapped them and confirmed that they existed. And yet they also feel like legends, because standing on the shore today, looking out at the waves, it is almost impossible to imagine that the seafloor beneath you was once a place where people walked and loved and built and dreamed. The water is so complete in its erasure. It leaves no trace visible to the eye. It takes and asks for nothing in return. But the sea does not take everything. It preserves as well as destroys. And sometimes, very rarely, it gives something back. A fishing net snags on a stone that turns out to be a carved pillar. A diver exploring a reef finds a piece of pottery half buried in the sand. A sonar survey reveals a grid of walls and streets beneath the silt. A storm shifts the sediments on a beach and exposes the remains of a forest that has been underwater for 8,000 years. Tree stumps still rooted in the soil where they grew, their wood darkened by millennia of immersion, but still recognizable, still holding the shape of life. These discoveries remind us that the line between myth and reality is thinner than we sometimes think. The stories our ancestors told about flooded kingdoms and drowned lands were not pure inventions. They were rooted in something. They were ways of making sense of a world that was constantly changing, constantly taking away what had once seemed permanent. The story of Atlantis, which we will explore in detail soon, may be the most famous of these narratives, but it is far from the only one, and it may have emerged from the same deep well of human experience that produced all the other flood myths and all the other legends of lost worlds. Consider the people of the Pacific Islands. For thousands of years they have navigated the vast expanses of the world's largest ocean using knowledge passed down from generation to generation. Knowledge of stars and currents and wave patterns and the behaviour of birds. Their oral traditions contain references to islands that no longer exist. Some of these islands were real places that sank due to volcanic activity or erosion. Some may have been low-lying atolls that disappeared beneath rising seas. And some may be memories of lands that were lost so long ago that only fragments of story remain, a name, a direction, a description of a mountain that can no longer be found. To dismiss these traditions as mere fantasy is to misunderstand how human memory works, and how deeply the experience of loss can embed itself in a culture's storytelling. We are the inheritors of these stories. We are the latest in a long line of humans who have stood at the edge of the water and wondered. The difference is that we have tools our ancestors could not have imagined: sonar and satellite imagery, and carbon dating and underwater archaeology. We can map the seafloor in extraordinary detail. We can send submersibles down into the darkness to photograph what remains. We can extract sediment cores and analyse them for pollen and charcoal and other signs of human habitation. And what we have found is that the oceans are indeed full of lost landscapes, full of places that were once above the water and are now below, full of evidence that the stories were not wrong. But we have also found that the truth is more complex than the legends suggest. The lost civilizations of our ancestors' stories were not necessarily the glittering empires of advanced technology that some modern theorists imagine. They were often communities of hunter-gatherers, or early farmers, or coastal traders. Their lives were modest by our standards. Their tools were stone and bone and wood. Their homes were simple structures of timber and thatch, and yet they were civilizations. In the truest sense, groups of people living together, creating culture, passing on knowledge, building relationships with the landscapes they inhabited. When the waters rose and took those landscapes, it took their worlds, and the memory of that loss echoed through the ages. We will visit many of these worlds in the hours ahead. Some will be familiar to you, Atlantis of course, and Lemuria and Mu. Others may be less familiar, Doggerland and Sundaland and the lost cities of the desert. But all of them share a common thread. All of them emerge from the same deep human need to remember what has been lost, to honour what has passed away, and to imagine what might have been. This need is ancient and it is universal. It is the reason we tell stories at all. It is the reason we are here now, drifting together through the night, listening to the quiet voice of history and myth. Feel the water beneath you, warm and dark and deep. Feel the weight of all those lost places, all those forgotten shores. They are not gone, they are only sleeping. And as we drift forward into the heart of the night, their stories will rise up around us like mist from the surface of the sea. Quiet, gentle, full of ancient light. The first story we will enter is the most famous of them all. The story of a great island, a powerful kingdom, and a philosopher who wrote down a tale that has fascinated the world for more than 2,000 years. The story of Atlantis. But before we reach its golden shores, let yourself rest in the quiet of the open water for a while longer. Let the rhythm of the waves carry you forward. There is no hurry. The night is long. The stories will wait. And the sea, as always, keeps its secrets close. And so the years moved quietly forward, like clouds across a pale and distant sky. Long ago, in a city of marble and olive trees, an old man sat in the shade of a colonnade and told a story. His name was Plato, and he was one of the most careful thinkers who ever lived, a philosopher who spent his life trying to understand the nature of truth, justice, and the ideal society. He was not a teller of tales. He was not a spinner of fables. He was a man who believed that reason could illuminate the darkest corners of existence. And yet in two of his later works, the dialogues called Timaeus and Critias, he told a story that has outshone everything else he ever wrote. A story that has launched 1,000 ships of imagination. A story about an island called Atlantis. Plato wrote these dialogues around 360 years before what we now call the Common Era. He was an old man then, near the end of his life. In the dialogues, he describes a conversation that supposedly took place years earlier, when his teacher Socrates met with several acquaintances to discuss philosophy and the ideal state. One of those acquaintances was a man named Critias, and it is Critias who tells the story of Atlantis. He claims that the story originally came from his grandfather, who heard it from his father, who heard it from the great Athenian lawgiver Solon, one of the wisest men of ancient Greece. And Solon, Critias explains, heard the story during a visit to Egypt from the priests of the temple at Sais in the Nile Delta. The Egyptian priests, who were keepers of records going back thousands of years, told Solon that the Greeks were like children. Their memories were short, their histories shallow. The Egyptians, by contrast, preserved knowledge of events far older, events that had been lost to the rest of humanity. And one of those events was the story of a great power that had existed 9,000 years before their time. A power centered on an island in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond what the Greeks called the Pillars of Heracles, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This was Atlantis. Picture now, as Plato's audience might have pictured, the island of Atlantis as Critias describes it. It was a place of extraordinary abundance. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for growing grain and fruit. The forests were full of timber and wildlife. The hills contained veins of precious metals, gold and silver, but also a metal called orichalcum, which gleamed like fire and was valued second only to gold. The climate was gentle, warm but tempered by sea breezes, with rains that came at just the right times to nourish the crops and fill the streams. The island itself was not small. Plato says it was larger than Libya and Asia combined, though what he meant by those names was different from what we mean today. It was a continent in miniature, a world unto itself. The landscape of Atlantis had been shaped by the god Poseidon, who had claimed the island as his domain. At its centre was a mountain, and on that mountain lived a woman named Cleito, who was an orphan. Her parents had died when she was young. Poseidon fell in love with her, and, to protect her and the children she would bear him, he shaped the mountain into a citadel. He carved rings of land and rings of water around the central hill, alternating circles like ripples spreading outward from a stone dropped into still water. The rings were perfectly concentric, perfectly spaced. They created a series of natural moats and ramparts that made the citadel almost impossible to attack. The outermost ring of land connected to the sea through a channel, so that ships could sail directly into the heart of the city. This was the sacred centre of Atlantis, the hill where Cleito had lived, the rings of earth and water that Poseidon had formed. All of it became the core of a great metropolis. Bridges spanned the rings of water, wide enough for chariots to cross. Towers guarded the bridges. Walls ringed the circles of land, walls of red, black and white stone, quarried from the rings themselves. And at the very centre, on the sacred hill, stood a temple to Poseidon and Cleito, a temple of breathtaking splendour. It was a stadium in length, its exterior covered in silver, except for the pinnacles which were covered in gold. Inside, the ceiling was ivory, decorated with gold and silver and orichalcum. Every surface seemed to glow. In the centre of the temple stood a pillar of orichalcum, inscribed with the laws that Poseidon had given to the people of Atlantis. And around the pillar, once a year, the rulers of Atlantis would gather to perform a solemn ritual. But we will come to that in time. The city extended outward from the citadel in a pattern of order and beauty. Canals had been dug to connect the rings of water to the sea, and along these canals were dockyards full of ships, triremes and merchant vessels from all over the known world. The harbours were busy with loading and unloading, with the cries of sailors and the creaking of ropes and the smell of spices and timber and salt fish. The city streets were laid out in a grid, radiating outward from the central rings. Houses climbed the hillsides, their white walls bright against the green of gardens and the blue of the sea. Aqueducts brought fresh water down from the mountains. Public baths and fountains were everywhere. The sound of running water was never absent. Beyond the city, the rest of the island was equally prosperous. The plain that surrounded the metropolis was flat and fertile, protected by mountains that curved around it like a sheltering arm. This plain was divided into 60,000 plots of land, each one assigned to a leader who was responsible for providing men and equipment for the military. The fields produced grain and fruit in such abundance that the people of Atlantis never knew hunger. Vineyards covered the hillsides. Orchards heavy with figs and olives and pomegranates stretched as far as the eye could see. Herds of cattle and flocks of sheep moved across the pastures, and the forests were full of game. The Atlanteans themselves, in Plato's telling, were a people of extraordinary qualities. They were tall and strong and beautiful. They were skilled in every art: music, architecture, engineering, navigation. Their ships travelled to every corner of the known world, trading goods and gathering knowledge. Their armies were the most powerful on Earth, with chariots and cavalry and heavily armed infantry. Their empire extended far beyond their own island. They ruled over parts of Europe and Africa, and their influence was felt everywhere. But what made Atlantis truly remarkable, in Plato's account, was not its wealth or its power. It was its justice. The rulers of Atlantis were descendants of Poseidon, and they governed according to the laws that their divine ancestor had established. They were wise and fair. They cared for their people. They lived modestly despite their wealth, knowing that true happiness came not from gold but from virtue. They were the ideal rulers of an ideal state, the kind of state that Plato had spent his life imagining. And then something changed. As the generations passed, the divine blood in the royal line grew thinner. The rulers of Atlantis became more human, more fallible. They began to value wealth over wisdom, power over justice. They became greedy and arrogant. They started wars of conquest, not defense. They oppressed their neighbors instead of helping them. They forgot the laws inscribed on the pillar of orichalcum. In the dialogue, Critias explains that the gods looked down on Atlantis and saw what it had become. And the chief of the gods, Zeus, decided that the Atlanteans must be punished, not out of anger, but out of a kind of divine necessity. The corruption of such a great civilization could not be allowed to spread. So Zeus gathered the gods together to decide the fate of Atlantis. And then, the dialogue breaks off. The text of Critias ends mid-sentence. We never learn what Zeus said. We never learn how the gods planned to punish Atlantis. But earlier, in the dialogue called Timaeus, the fate of Atlantis is already described. The island was destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophe, earthquakes, floods, and then a final sinking beneath the waves. The sea swallowed Atlantis so completely that, in Plato's words, it became an impassable barrier of mud, a shoal that prevented ships from sailing through that part of the ocean. And so the great civilization vanished, leaving behind only a story, preserved by the Egyptians and passed down to the Greeks through Solon and Critias, and finally Plato himself. Was any of this true? Plato himself seemed uncertain, or perhaps he was being deliberately ambiguous. In Timaeus, when Socrates comments on the story, he says it is valuable not because it is literally true, but because it illustrates something about the nature of societies and the dangers of corruption. And yet Plato also goes to great lengths to establish the story's credibility, the chain of transmission from Egyptian priests to Solon to Critias, the precise details of geography and architecture, the solemnity with which the tale is told. He seems to want his readers to believe, even as he leaves room for doubt. This ambiguity has fueled 2 millennia of speculation. Some have argued that Atlantis was a pure invention, a thought experiment, a cautionary tale, a way for Plato to illustrate his political philosophy without directly criticizing Athens. Others have insisted that Plato was recording a genuine tradition, a memory of a real place and a real catastrophe. And still others have tried to find Atlantis in every corner of the earth, under the Atlantic, in the Mediterranean, in the Caribbean, off the coast of Spain, in the middle of the Sahara. We will explore many of these theories as the night unfolds, but for now, let us stay with Plato's Atlantis, the Atlantis of the imagination, the city of golden temples and circular harbours, and wise kings who slowly forgot their wisdom. Let us walk its streets in the quiet of this moment. Feel the warmth of the sun on the white stone. Hear the water running in the canals and fountains. Smell the salt and the spice and the flowers. See the ships in the harbour, their sails furled, their crews resting in the shade. The Atlanteans go about their daily lives, buying and selling, building and planting, loving and arguing and dreaming. They do not know what is coming. They do not know that the sea, which has always been their friend and their highway, will one day rise up and take everything. They live in the present, as we all do, unaware of how their story will end. And that is part of the power of the Atlantis myth. It is not just a story about a lost civilization. It is a story about the fragility of all civilizations. It reminds us that nothing is permanent, that the greatest cities and the mightiest empires can fall, that the sea is patient and the earth can shift, and what seems solid can become liquid. This is a truth that every human culture has had to confront, and it is a truth that still resonates today, perhaps more strongly than ever. The temple at the center of Atlantis stands quiet now in the fading light of the afternoon. The pillar of orichalcum gleams with the last rays of the sun. Soon the rulers will gather for their annual ceremony, but they do not know that it will be one of their last. They do not know that the gods have already turned their faces away. They lift their cups and speak their oaths, and the words sound hollow even to their own ears, though they cannot say why. Outside, the sea is calm. The horizon is clear. There is no sign of the catastrophe to come. But the catastrophe did come, if Plato's account is to be believed. And the sea closed over the golden towers, and the marble temples, and the bridges, and the gardens, and the docks. The fish swam through the halls of the palace, the coral grew on the statues of the gods, and the story of Atlantis became a story, passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, slowly changing shape, as all stories do, until it reached the ears of an old philosopher in Athens who wrote it down and made it immortal. And time, as it always does, continued its slow drift, carrying the memory of Atlantis into the centuries that followed. In the centuries after Plato's death, the story of Atlantis did not fade. It grew. It spread through the ancient world like ripples on still water, touching shore after shore, generation after generation. Some people read Plato's dialogues and accepted Atlantis as historical fact. Others saw it as allegory, a beautiful fiction crafted to teach moral lessons. And still others took the story as a starting point for their own speculations, their own theories, their own visions of what might lie beneath the waves. The Greeks who came after Plato were the first to wrestle with the story. Some of them, like the philosopher Crantor, who lived about a century after Plato, reportedly travelled to Egypt to verify the tale. According to the later writer Proclus, Crantor found Egyptian priests who confirmed that the story was preserved in their temple records. Carved in hieroglyphs on pillars, that still stood in the temple at Sais. If this account is true, it represents the earliest known attempt to find evidence for Atlantis. But the pillars, if they ever existed, are long gone. The temple at Sais is in ruins. The records that might have confirmed or disproved the story have been lost to time. Other Greek and Roman writers took up the tale with enthusiasm. The geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, mentioned Atlantis briefly, noting that some people believed it was real and others did not. The natural historian Pliny the Elder described the Atlantic Ocean and speculated about lands that might lie beyond it. The biographer Plutarch wrote about the Egyptian sources of the Atlantis story and seemed inclined to believe them. And the philosopher Posidonius, whose works are largely lost but were influential in their time, apparently discussed Atlantis at length, and may have suggested that it was a real place that had suffered a real catastrophe. But it was in the centuries after the fall of Rome that the story of Atlantis took on new life. As the classical world crumbled and Europe entered what some would later call the Dark Ages, the works of Plato were preserved in the libraries of Byzantium and the monasteries of the Islamic world. Arab scholars read the dialogues and commented on them. They added their own interpretations, blending Greek philosophy with Islamic theology. Some of them suggested that Atlantis might be connected to the people of Ad mentioned in the Quran, a powerful ancient civilization that had been destroyed for their arrogance. Others speculated about the location of the Lost Island, placing it in the Atlantic or the Indian Ocean or the waters beyond the known world. When the Renaissance dawned in Europe and classical learning was rediscovered, Atlantis came flooding back into the Western imagination. The dialogues of Plato were translated into Latin and then into vernacular languages. Scholars pored over the text with fresh eyes. They compared Plato's descriptions to the geography of the known world and proposed theories about where Atlantis might have been. The discovery of the Americas added a new dimension to the search. Could the new continents be the remains of Atlantis? Could the indigenous peoples of the Americas be descendants of the lost civilization? These questions were debated in universities and salons and coffee houses across Europe. One of the most influential early modern works on Atlantis was written by an English scholar named John Swan, who published a book called Speculum Mundi in 1635. Swan argued that Atlantis had been a real place, located in the Atlantic Ocean, and that the discovery of the Americas had confirmed Plato's account of a great landmass beyond the Pillars of Heracles. His book helped spark a wave of interest in Atlantis that continued for centuries. Other writers followed with their own theories. Some placed Atlantis in the Americas, some placed it in Scandinavia, some placed it in Africa, and some, like the Swedish scholar Olof Rudbeck, went to extraordinary lengths to prove that Atlantis was actually located in Sweden, an effort that consumed much of his life and produced volumes of elaborate, ultimately unconvincing scholarship. By the 19th century, the search for Atlantis had become intertwined with new developments in science and archaeology. The young science of geology was revealing that the Earth was far older than anyone had previously imagined, and that it had undergone dramatic changes over the millennia. Mountains rising, seas expanding and contracting, continents shifting. Could these processes explain the disappearance of Atlantis? Some geologists thought so. The discovery of ancient ruins in Egypt and Mesopotamia showed that sophisticated civilizations had existed much earlier than European scholars had believed. Perhaps Atlantis was another such civilization waiting to be found. The decipherment of hieroglyphics and cuneiform opened up new sources of information about the ancient world, and some researchers scoured these texts for clues about the lost island. At the same time, a new kind of Atlantis literature emerged, books that were not just scholarly studies but imaginative reconstructions of what Atlantis might have been like. The most famous of these was Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882 by an American congressman named Ignatius Donnelly. Donnelly's book was a sensation. In it, he argued that Atlantis had been a real continent in the Atlantic Ocean, that it had been the original source of all human civilization, and that its destruction in a great catastrophe had left behind only scattered memories in the myths and legends of cultures around the world. The pyramids of Egypt, the megaliths of Europe, the advanced knowledge of the Maya, all of it, Donnelly argued, could be traced back to Atlantis. Donnelly's book was not good science by modern standards. He cherry-picked evidence, made sweeping claims on flimsy grounds, and ignored anything that contradicted his thesis. But he captured the public imagination in a way that few books have. His Atlantis was a romantic vision of a lost golden age, an advanced civilization that had achieved wonders before its tragic end. This vision resonated with readers who were living through a time of rapid technological change and social upheaval, readers who looked to the past with a mixture of nostalgia and wonder. Donnelly's Atlantis became the Atlantis of popular culture, and its influence can still be felt today. Around the same time, the famous psychic and occultist Madame Helena Blavatsky incorporated Atlantis into her elaborate cosmology. In her books, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky described Atlantis as one of several root races that had existed on Earth before modern humans. The Atlanteans, in her telling, were a spiritually advanced people who had eventually fallen into corruption and been destroyed. Their civilization had left behind esoteric knowledge that had been passed down through secret societies and could be recovered by those who were spiritually prepared. Blavatsky's Atlantis was not a historical hypothesis but a religious vision, and it found a devoted following among spiritual seekers around the world. Throughout the 20th century, the search for Atlantis continued on multiple fronts. Archaeologists explored sites that had been proposed as possible locations. The volcanic island of Thera, now known as Santorini, emerged as a particularly compelling candidate. This island in the Aegean Sea had been home to a sophisticated Minoan civilization until around 1600 BCE, when a catastrophic volcanic eruption blew the island apart and triggered tsunamis that devastated the surrounding region. The destruction of Thera bore striking similarities to Plato's account of Atlantis. The great civilization, the catastrophic end, the sinking beneath the sea, and the timing, while not matching Plato's 9,000-year figure, was close enough to suggest that Plato might have been drawing on a distorted memory of this real event. Other researchers looked elsewhere. The Caribbean, with its shallow waters and numerous islands, attracted attention. The coast of Spain, near Cadiz, was proposed based on geological and archaeological evidence. The marshes of the Doñana National Park were surveyed using ground-penetrating radar. The Azores, far out in the Atlantic, were suggested as possible mountaintop remnants of the sunken continent. Every few years a new expedition set out, a new theory was advanced, a new hope was kindled, and every few years the evidence proved insufficient. The theory collapsed, and Atlantis remained elusive. But the search was never really about finding a physical location. It was about something deeper. The search for Atlantis was a search for meaning, for a lost golden age, for a warning about hubris, for a connection to the deep past. Every explorer who scanned the seafloor with sonar, every scholar who pored over ancient texts, every dreamer who looked out at the ocean and wondered, they were all part of a tradition that stretched back to Plato himself, a tradition of asking questions that might not have answers, of seeking truths that might exist only in the imagination. And what about the Egyptians who supposedly preserved the story in their temples? In the centuries since Plato, researchers have searched Egyptian records for any mention of Atlantis. They have found none. The Egyptian priest Manetho, writing in the 3rd century, before the Common Era, compiled a history of Egypt that included many myths and legends, but no Atlantis. the vast corpus of Egyptian religious texts, with their elaborate cosmologies and their stories of the gods, contains nothing that clearly matches Plato's tale. This absence does not disprove the story, but it does leave the Egyptian connection unconfirmed, a missing link in the chain of transmission. Perhaps the Egyptian priests of Plato's story were not recording a historical fact, but telling a philosophical tale of their own, a tale that they knew would resonate with their Greek visitor. The Egyptians had their own traditions of lost civilizations and great floods. They had their own stories of divine punishment and cosmic destruction. They were masters of symbolism and allegory. It is not hard to imagine them crafting a story that would convey deep truths in the form of history, a story that would travel back to Greece and eventually find its way into Plato's dialogues, where it would become the most enduring legend of the Western world. Wherever Atlantis was or was not, its story has become one of the great shared dreams of humanity. It has inspired artists and writers and filmmakers. It has fueled scientific expeditions and pseudo-scientific fantasies. It has served as a mirror in which every age sees its own hopes and fears reflected. For the Renaissance, Atlantis was a sign that the ancients had known more than the moderns realized. For the 19th century, it was a lost paradise of spiritual wisdom. For the 20th century, it was a cautionary tale about technological hubris. And for us, in the quiet of this night, it is something else, a story to hold gently, to turn over like a smooth stone found on a beach, to appreciate for its beauty rather than its literal truth. The long search for Atlantis continues, and perhaps it always will. There is something in us that needs to search it, that needs to believe there is something out there, beneath the waves or beyond the horizon, waiting to be found. And whether Atlantis existed or not, the search itself has value. It has taught us about the real drowned landscapes of our planet. It has connected us to the fears and hopes of our ancestors. It has reminded us that the world is full of mysteries, and that mystery itself is a kind of gift. And so the search goes on, quietly, as searches for lost things always do. The sea kept its silence, and the story rested once more, waiting for the next tide of human curiosity to rise. Now let us drift away from the bright Mediterranean and the stormy Atlantic, away from the marble columns and golden temples of Plato's imagination. Let the currents carry us eastward, around the curve of Africa, past the Arabian Peninsula, and into the vast warm expanse of the Indian Ocean. The water here is different, softer in colour, deeper in temperature, scented with the spices that have travelled these trade routes for thousands of years. The sky above is hazy with heat and moisture, and the horizon seems to stretch into infinity, a blur of blue meeting blue. This is the realm of a different kind of lost civilization. Not Atlantis, but Lemuria. The story of Lemuria is younger than the story of Atlantis, but it is no less strange or beautiful. It began not with a philosopher's dialogue, but with a scientific puzzle. In the middle of the 19th century, naturalists were struggling to understand the distribution of certain animals across the globe. The British zoologist Philip Sclater noticed something peculiar in 1864. Lemurs, those wide-eyed, soft-furred primates with their long tails and gentle grasping hands, were found in Madagascar, in Africa, in India, and across the islands of Southeast Asia. But they were absent from the lands in between. How could this be? The lemurs could not have swum across the vast stretches of the Indian Ocean. There must have been a land connection, a bridge that once linked these far-flung regions. Sclater proposed a solution to this puzzle. He suggested that a large continent had once existed in the Indian Ocean, connecting Madagascar to India and Southeast Asia. This continent would have provided a migration route for lemurs and other animals, allowing them to spread across what are now isolated islands and distant shores. Sclater named this hypothetical landmass Lemuria, after the lemurs whose distribution it was meant to explain. He was not imagining a lost human civilization. He was simply proposing a geological explanation for a biological pattern. But the name he gave it, Lemuria, would take on a life of its own. The idea of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean captured the imagination of Sclater's contemporaries. Other scientists took up the theory and expanded upon it. The German biologist Ernst Haeckel, a great popularizer of evolutionary ideas, suggested that Lemuria might have been the original homeland of humanity, the place where the first humans evolved before spreading across the globe. This was a grand and dramatic claim, and it gave Lemuria a significance that went far beyond the distribution of lemurs. It became a candidate for the cradle of humankind, a lost Eden beneath the Indian Ocean. But even as scientists were proposing and debating the existence of Lemuria, the theory was being undermined by new discoveries. The science of plate tectonics, which would eventually explain the movement of continents, was still decades away. But geologists were already learning that the Earth's crust was not as stable as it seemed. They were mapping the ocean floor and finding no evidence of a sunken continent in the Indian Ocean. They were studying the rocks of India and Madagascar and finding that while they had indeed once been connected, the connection was part of the ancient supercontinent Gondwana, a landmass that had broken apart hundreds of millions of years ago, long before lemurs or humans existed. The lemurs, it turned out, had not needed a land bridge. They were living relics of a much older time, their distribution explained by continental drift rather than a sunken continent. By the early 20th century, the scientific theory of Lemuria had been abandoned. Geologists no longer believed in it. Biologists no longer needed it. But the idea refused to die. It had already escaped from the laboratory and the lecture hall. It had entered the realm of myth. And in that realm, it found fertile ground. Because the Indian Ocean was not empty of stories about lost lands. Far from it. The Tamil people of southern India and Sri Lanka had their own traditions, ancient, deeply held traditions, about a great land that had once existed to the south, a land that had been swallowed by the sea. This land was called Kumari Kandam, and its story was woven into the fabric of Tamil literature, identity, and belief. Picture the southern tip of India, where the land narrows to a point at Kanyakumari, the Cape Comorin. The waters here are the meeting place of three great bodies of water: the Bay of Bengal to the east, the Arabian Sea to the west, and the Indian Ocean to the south. The beaches are golden, the palm trees lean toward the water, and the sunsets are the colour of mangoes and roses. For thousands of years, this has been a place of pilgrimage, a sacred site associated with the goddess Kumari. And according to Tamil tradition, this was once the northernmost point of a much larger land. The stories tell of a vast continent that stretched far to the south of present-day India. It was a land of great rivers and towering mountains, the Kumari River and the Pahruli River, the Meru and Kumari Mountains. It was divided into 49 territories, each with its own ruler. It was the home of the Tamil people, the place where their language and culture first developed. The first two great literary academies, the Sangams, were said to have flourished on this southern continent. Poets and scholars gathered there, producing works of extraordinary beauty and wisdom. The Tamil language reached its highest perfection in those days, and the arts and sciences thrived under the patronage of generous kings. Then the sea rose. According to the tradition, the first great flood swallowed the land south of the Kumari River. The capital city of Tenmadurai was lost beneath the waves. The first Sangam was destroyed. The survivors moved north and established a new capital, Kapatapuram, and a second Sangam. For a time, Tamil civilization flourished again, but the sea was not finished. A second flood came, and it swallowed Kapatapuram and the second Sangam. Once again, the survivors moved north. They established the third Sangam at the city of Madurai, which still stands today in the state of Tamil Nadu, and the literature of that third Sangam, some of which has survived, contains fragments that seem to hint at the lost lands to the south. Was Kumari Kandam a memory of real events? Geological evidence shows that sea levels in the Indian Ocean were indeed lower during the last ice age. The continental shelf around India extends significantly beyond the present shoreline, especially to the south. Land that is now submerged would have been above water 10 or 15,000 years ago. Sri Lanka was connected to the Indian mainland by a land bridge. The Gulf of Mannar was dry land, and further south, the ocean floor drops off into the deep waters of the Indian Ocean, but the exact contours of the ancient coastline are still being mapped. It is entirely possible that human communities lived on land that is now underwater. It is entirely possible that the memory of those communities and their gradual loss to rising seas was preserved in oral traditions that eventually became the stories of Kumari Kandam. But the Tamil traditions were not just about a lost land, they were about a lost civilization, a civilization that had achieved remarkable things in literature, science, and statecraft. And this is where the story of Kumari Kandam intersected with the Western idea of Lemuria. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Tamil scholars and nationalists discovered the Lemuria theory and recognized its potential. Here was a Western scientific hypothesis that seemed to confirm what their own traditions had always said, that a great continent had once existed in the Indian Ocean and had been destroyed by the sea. They embraced Lemuria as the Western name for Kumari Kandam. They used it to assert the antiquity and greatness of Tamil civilization in the face of colonial rule. Lemuria became a symbol of pride and identity, and so two streams of story flowed together, one from the laboratories and libraries of Europe, one from the temples and poetry halls of southern India. They mingled and merged into a single river of legend. Lemuria Kumari Kandam became a lost civilization to rival Atlantis. It was described as a land of great cities and advanced knowledge, a center of learning and spirituality that had influenced cultures around the world. Some proponents claimed that the survivors of Lemuria had fled to other lands after the catastrophe, carrying with them the seeds of civilization, to Egypt, to Mesopotamia, to the Indus Valley, to the Americas. Lemuria became a global origin story, an alternative to the Atlantis myth, a different vision of humanity's deep past. And then there were the occultists. Just as Atlantis had been absorbed into the esoteric cosmology of Madame Blavatsky and her followers, so too was Lemuria. In Blavatsky's system, Lemuria was an even older root race than Atlantis. The Lemurians were the third root race, living on a continent that had existed in the Indian and Pacific Oceans millions of years ago. They were described as giant hermaphroditic beings with psychic powers and a deep connection to the natural world. They did not build cities or develop technology in the way we understand it. Their civilization was spiritual rather than material, and like the Atlanteans after them, they eventually declined and were destroyed, their continent sinking beneath the waves. This occult version of Lemuria had little to do with Sclater's zoological hypothesis or the Tamil traditions of Kumari Kandam. It was a pure product of the spiritual imagination, a vision of a lost age of innocence and psychic power, and it proved enormously influential in certain circles. Theosophical societies around the world taught the story of Lemuria as part of their cosmology. It appeared in books and pamphlets and lectures. It mingled with other esoteric ideas about Atlantis and lost continents and secret knowledge, and it added yet another layer to the already complex mythology of the Indian Ocean. Meanwhile, the geological evidence continued to accumulate. The theory of plate tectonics, which became firmly established in the mid-20th century, explained the history of the Indian Ocean with remarkable precision. India had once been part of the supercontinent Gondwana, along with Africa, South America, Antarctica, and Australia. About 100 million years ago, India broke away and began a long, slow journey northward. It moved across the ancient Tethys Ocean at a rate of several centimeters per year, a geological sprint. Around 50 million years ago, it collided with Asia, and the impact, slow, unimaginably powerful, pushed up the Himalayan mountains. The Indian Ocean floor was not the remnant of a sunken continent. It was a relatively young seafloor, created by the spreading of the ocean ridges as India moved north. This evidence ruled out the existence of a large continent in the Indian Ocean in the relatively recent geological past. But it did not rule out the possibility that smaller areas of land, extensions of the continental shelf, had been exposed during the ice ages and subsequently submerged. And it did not rule out the possibility that human communities had lived on those coastal plains and had been forced to retreat as the waters rose. The scientific Lemuria was dead. The historical Kumari Kandam remained a possibility, unproven but not impossible. Recent archaeological work has added new dimensions to the story. Underwater surveys off the coast of Tamil Nadu have found evidence of submerged structures, stone alignments, possible walls, geometric patterns that do not appear to be natural. At a site called Poompuhar, divers have discovered the remains of what might be an ancient port city, now several kilometers offshore and many meters underwater. Carbon dating of materials from these sites has yielded ages of several thousand years. Not tens of thousands, but still old enough to suggest that significant settlements existed along the ancient coastline before the sea rose to its present level. At the same time, researchers have studied the Tamil Sangam literature with new attention, looking for clues about geography and historical events. The poems describe rivers that no longer exist, cities that are no longer on the map, coastlines that differ from the present shore. Some of these descriptions may be purely mythical, others may encode genuine memories of landscape change. The challenge is distinguishing between the two, and that challenge remains largely unmet. What we are left with is a story that operates on multiple levels. There is the scientific Lemuria, a hypothesis that served its purpose and was then superseded. There is the Tamil Kumari Kandam, a tradition that may preserve memories of real land loss and cultural upheaval. And there is the occult Lemuria, a spiritual vision that speaks to deep human longings for a lost age of harmony and wisdom. All three coexist in the modern imagination, tangled together like roots of an ancient banyan tree. Let yourself drift now across the waters where these stories are set. The Indian Ocean at night is a place of extraordinary peace. The waves are long and gentle, the wind warm and steady, the stars are bright overhead, and the phosphorescence in the water creates trails of soft greenish light behind every swell. Beneath the surface in the deep is a world of secrets, coral reefs and volcanic seamounts, the wrecks of ships that foundered in storms, the silt-covered contours of ancient shorelines, and perhaps somewhere down there, the remains of settlements that were once alive with voices and fires and the sounds of daily life. The Tamil poems speak of the lost land with a tender melancholy, not as a place of wonder and magic, but as a home. A place where people lived and loved and raised their children. A place that was taken from them by the indifferent sea. This is the heart of the Lemuria story, beneath all the theories and speculations. It is a story about loss, about the vulnerability of human communities to the forces of nature, about the way we remember what we can no longer see, about the stories we tell to keep the past alive. Whether Lemuria existed as a continent or not, the longing it represents is real. The Tamil people who speak of Kumari Kandam are not inventing a fantasy. They are honouring a memory that has been shaped by time and storytelling, but a memory nonetheless. And the Western scientists who proposed the name Lemuria were not fools. They were doing what scientists do, trying to explain what they observed, using the tools and concepts available to them. Their theory was wrong in its specifics, but it was right in its intuition that the Earth's surface had changed dramatically over time. and that these changes had shaped the distribution of life. Now, as you rest in the quiet of the night, let the image of Lemuria settle in your mind like a distant shore seen through mist. Not a place to be located on a map, not a theory to be proven or disproven, but a feeling. The feeling of something precious and irretrievable resting beneath the waves. The feeling of a homeland that exists only in stories. The feeling of looking out across the water and knowing that something was once there and is no longer and will never be again. That feeling is the truest expression of the Lemuria myth, and it connects us across time and space to everyone who has ever stood on a shoreline and mourned what the sea had taken. And so the story of Lemuria rests now in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean, drifting with the currents, waiting to be remembered by those who dream of lost worlds. Time, as it always does, continued its slow drift, and the mists over the eastern sea began to part, revealing yet another ocean, yet another legend, yet another civilization waiting in the deep. The Pacific Ocean is the largest single feature on the face of the Earth. It covers more than 60 million square miles, an area larger than all of the planet's land masses combined. It is so vast that when you stand on its shores and look out, you are seeing water that stretches unbroken for thousands upon thousands of miles. Water that touches Asia and the Americas and Antarctica and Australia. Water that holds islands like scattered seeds thrown across a blue eternity. The Pacific is not just an ocean. It is a world unto itself, a realm of distances so immense that the human mind struggles to comprehend them. And yet, across those distances, people travelled. Thousands of years before European navigators ventured beyond sight of land, the peoples of the Pacific were building voyaging canoes and setting out across the open sea. They navigated by stars and swells and the flight paths of birds. They found islands that were mere specks of green in an endless blue, islands separated by hundreds or thousands of miles of water. They settled those islands and built communities and created cultures of extraordinary richness and complexity. And they told stories of islands that rose from the sea and islands that sank beneath it, stories of great lands that once existed and were now gone. It was these stories, in part, that inspired one of the strangest and most persistent legends of a lost civilization, the legend of Mu. The story of Mu begins, like so many lost civilization stories, in the 19th century. It begins with a Frenchman named Augustus Le Plongeon, an archaeologist and photographer who spent years studying the ruins of the Maya in Yucatan. Le Plongeon was convinced that the Maya had been the inheritors of a much older civilization, a civilization that had existed on a continent in the Atlantic Ocean, a continent that had been destroyed by a great catastrophe. He called this lost land Mu, a name he derived from his interpretation of Maya hieroglyphics. But Le Plongeon's Mu was essentially Atlantis under a different name. The true Mu, the Mu of the Pacific, was the creation of another man entirely. His name was James Churchward. He was born in England in 1851 and lived a long and colourful life: soldier, inventor, tea planter, and eventually author. In the 1920s and 1930s, Churchward published a series of books that laid out his vision of Mu in extraordinary detail. According to Churchward, Mu had been a vast continent in the Pacific Ocean, stretching from Hawaii to Fiji, from Easter Island to the Marianas. It was the original homeland of humanity, the place where civilization first emerged more than 50,000 years ago. The people of Mu were advanced beyond anything known in recorded history. They built great cities of stone. They mastered technologies that modern science has only begun to rediscover. They created a peaceful and prosperous society that lasted for tens of thousands of years. Churchward claimed that he had learned about Mu not from archaeological research or geological surveys, but from ancient tablets that he had been shown in India. These tablets, he said, were written in a mysterious script called Narkal, a script that only a handful of priests in remote monasteries could still read. With the help of one such priest, Churchward translated the tablets and uncovered the story of Mu. The tablets described the geography of the lost continent, its history, its religion, and its eventual destruction. They revealed that Mu had been destroyed by a series of catastrophic earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The land sank beneath the waves and the sea closed over it. The survivors fled to other parts of the world, where they became the founders of the civilizations we know from history: Egypt, India, China, the Americas. It was a magnificent story. It was also entirely unsupported by any evidence that Churchward was ever able to produce. The Narkal tablets were never seen by anyone else. The Indian monastery, where they were supposedly kept, was never located. Churchward's descriptions of Mu's geography, a vast continent of rolling plains and great rivers and 7 cities of gold, did not match anything that geologists had found on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific seafloor, far from being the remnant of a sunken continent, is composed of relatively young volcanic rock, created by the spreading of tectonic plates. There are no continental rocks beneath the deep Pacific. There never were. But Churchward's books sold remarkably well. They appealed to a public that was hungry for stories of lost worlds and ancient wisdom. His detailed descriptions of Mu, the 7 cities, the sacred temples, the advanced technology, the tragic destruction, were vivid and compelling. They painted a picture of a golden age that had been lost to human folly, a theme that resonated deeply in the aftermath of the First World War. Churchward's Mu joined the growing pantheon of lost civilizations, taking its place alongside Donnelly's Atlantis and Blavatsky's Lemuria. And yet, the legend of Mu did not emerge from nothing. Churchward may have invented the details, but the Pacific was full of genuine traditions about lost lands. The peoples of the Pacific Islands had their own stories that were far older and far more authentic than anything in Churchward's books. These stories told of islands that had risen from the sea and islands that had sunk. They told of voyages between lands that no longer existed. They told of ancestors who had come from places that could no longer be found. Consider the legend of Hiva, known to the people of the Marquesas Islands. Hiva was said to be a great land that once existed somewhere to the west. It was the homeland of the Marquesan people, the place from which their ancestors had sailed. But Hiva was no longer there. It had sunk beneath the ocean, destroyed by the gods for reasons that varied from telling to telling. The survivors had fled in their canoes, navigating by the stars, eventually finding their way to the islands where their descendants live today. Or consider the story of Hawaii, the ancestral homeland of the Polynesian peoples. Hawaii, sometimes rendered as Hawaiki or Savai, appears in traditions across the Pacific, from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island. It is described as a place of great abundance, a spiritual homeland, a source of mana and knowledge. Whether it was a real place or a mythical one, or some combination of both, is a question that scholars have debated for generations. Some have suggested that Hawaii was a memory of the islands of Western Polynesia, Samoa, Tonga, Fiji, from which the Polynesian voyagers set out to colonize the Eastern Pacific. Others have seen it as a purely spiritual concept, a paradise that exists beyond the physical world. Whatever the case, the tradition of Hawaii speaks to a deep awareness that the present islands of the Pacific are not the whole story. Something came before, something was left behind, and then there are the submerged landscapes that modern science has confirmed. During the last ice age, when sea levels were lower, many of the islands of the Pacific were larger than they are today. In some cases, islands that are now separate were connected into larger land masses. The continental shelves around Australia and New Guinea formed a single continent known as Sahul. The islands of Southeast Asia were connected to the Asian mainland as part of Sundaland, which we will explore in a later chapter. Even in the deeper Pacific, sea level changes would have exposed additional land around many island groups. These changes were gradual enough that human communities would have noticed them. Coastlines shifted, fishing grounds moved, islands that had been visible on the horizon slowly disappeared beneath the waves. These were real events, experienced by real people over many generations. The most intriguing evidence for lost lands in the Pacific comes not from the deep ocean, but from the shallow waters around existing islands. Off the coast of Yonaguni, the southernmost of the Japanese Ryukyu Islands, divers have discovered a remarkable underwater formation, a series of terraces, steps and platforms that some researchers believe could be the remains of a human-made structure. The Yonaguni Monument, as it has come to be called, rises from the seafloor at depths of up to 25 meters. Its surfaces are strikingly flat, its edges sharply angled. It looks to the untrained eye like a stepped pyramid or a ceremonial platform. If it is indeed artificial, it would date from a time when sea levels were much lower, perhaps 10,000 years ago or more. Mainstream geologists, however, are skeptical. They point out that the sandstone of which the Yonaguni Monument is composed is prone to fracturing along straight lines. The flat surfaces and right angles, they argue, could be entirely natural, the result of tectonic activity and wave erosion. The debate continues, and the evidence remains inconclusive. What is certain is that during the last ice age, the Ryukyu Islands were connected to the Asian mainland by a land bridge, and the region would have been a favourable environment for human settlement. Whether the Yonaguni Monument is a human construction or a natural formation, it stands as a reminder of how much of the ancient world lies hidden beneath the sea. Far to the east, across thousands of miles of open ocean, another island holds its own mysteries. Easter Island, Rapa Nui, as its Polynesian inhabitants call it, is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. It is famous for its moai, the massive stone statues that stand gazing inland from stone platforms along the coast. According to Rapa Nui tradition, the island was once part of a much larger landmass. The first settlers, led by the legendary chief Hotu Matua, arrived from a land called Hiva that had sunk beneath the sea. They brought with them the knowledge of carving and erecting the moai, knowledge that had been passed down from their ancestors on the lost continent. When they arrived at Rapa Nui, they found only a small island, but they made it their home, building a society that flourished for centuries before facing its own crises of resource depletion and social upheaval. The idea that Easter Island is a remnant of a larger landmass is not supported by geology. The island is a volcanic peak rising from the deep ocean floor, and it has never been significantly larger than it is today. But the tradition of Hiva, like the traditions of Hawaii and Kumari Kandam, may encode a memory of a different kind of loss. Not the sinking of a continent, but the departure from a homeland. The Polynesian voyagers who settled the Pacific Islands left behind the lands of their ancestors. They sailed into the unknown, knowing they might never return. The islands they found were small and isolated, surrounded by the immensity of the ocean. It is not hard to imagine that the memory of the larger, more abundant lands they had left behind would be transformed over generations into stories of a great continent that had been lost. And so the Pacific holds its secrets close, as it always has. The ocean is too large, too deep, too indifferent to human questions. Its floor is scarred by trenches and ridges and volcanic peaks. Its waters have swallowed countless islands and coastlines. Its currents carry fragments of story from one archipelago to another, mixing and merging and changing as they go. The legend of Mu, as James Churchward told it, is almost certainly a fantasy, a product of one man's imagination, dressed up in the language of ancient wisdom. But the deeper story, the story of real lands lost to real people, of voyages undertaken and homes abandoned, of memories transformed into myth, that story is true. It is written in the geology of the Pacific, in the genetics of its peoples, in the oral traditions that have been passed down for thousands of years. Drift now across the moonlit surface of the greatest ocean on Earth. Below you, in the darkness, are mountains taller than Everest, trenches deeper than the Grand Canyon, plains wider than the steppes of Asia, and scattered across that immense landscape are the remnants of human presence. Stone tools dropped by ancient fishermen, the wrecks of canoes that set out and never arrived, the foundations of villages that stood on shores that are now 100 meters underwater. The Pacific is full of ghosts, not the ghosts of a lost super civilization, but the ghosts of ordinary people who lived and died in a world that has since been transformed. Their stories are quieter than the story of Mu, but they're no less worthy of our attention. They are the true lost civilizations of the Pacific. And so the great ocean rested, holding its memories in its depths, while the moon traced its slow path across the sky. The sea kept its silence, and the currents of the Pacific carried the fragments of old stories gently, endlessly, toward shores that had not yet been born. We have journeyed now through the imagined realms of Atlantis and Lemuria and Mu, the golden cities, the temples of Orichalcum, the continents that sank beneath the waves in the dreams of philosophers and mystics. But now, let us turn our attention to something different, something quieter perhaps, but in its own way more remarkable. Let us explore the lost worlds that we know, with as much certainty as science can provide, actually existed. Not legends, not speculations, real places where real people lived that are now beneath the sea. These are the drowned landscapes of the last ice age. They are not the product of any single imagination or tradition. They are the product of geological forces and climate cycles that have shaped our planet for millions of years, and their rediscovery in recent decades has transformed our understanding of human history. The story begins with ice. 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last glacial period, so much water was locked up in the great ice sheets that covered northern Europe, Asia, and America that global sea levels were about 120 meters, nearly 400 feet, lower than they are today. The coastlines of the world were completely different. Lands that are now underwater were exposed. Britain was not an island. Siberia was connected to Alaska. Southeast Asia was a vast peninsula. Australia and New Guinea were a single continent. The map of the world was not the map we know. It was a map of a lost planet. Let us drift first to the shallow waters between Britain and mainland Europe. The North Sea, the English Channel, the waters that today are busy with shipping lanes and fishing boats and offshore wind farms. Wind back the clock to 12,000 years ago, and this was not sea at all. It was a vast lowland plain, stretching from the white cliffs of Dover to the marshes of Denmark and the Netherlands. Scientists have named this lost land Doggerland, after the Dogger Bank, a shallow area in the North Sea that was once a range of low hills at the heart of the plain. Doggerland was a rich and fertile landscape. Imagine it on a summer evening as the sun sinks low over the western horizon. The air is cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and birch and the earthy smell of marshland. The plain stretches away in gentle undulations, low hills covered in grass and heather, shallow valleys where streams wind slowly toward the distant sea, wide marshes where reeds and rushes sway in the breeze. Herds of deer move through the grasslands, wild boar root in the undergrowth, otters play in the streams, birds, ducks and geese and waders fill the wetlands with their calls, and everywhere the soft, steady murmur of water. People lived here. They were hunter-gatherers, descendants of the communities that had survived the worst of the Ice Age in refuges to the south. As the climate warmed and the ice retreated, they moved north, following the animals and the seasons. They knew this landscape intimately. They knew where the deer would be in each season, where the fish would run, where the flint for their tools could be found. They moved through the year in patterns that had been established over generations. They camped by rivers and lakes. They built shelters of wood and hide. They sat around fires in the evening, telling stories, repairing tools, watching the stars emerge. They left traces behind. Archaeologists have found their tools, beautifully worked flint blades and axes and arrowheads, in the sediments of the North Sea floor. Fishermen have dredged up bones of mammoths and aurochs and other Ice Age animals, and alongside them occasionally the worked stone tools that prove human presence. In recent years, underwater surveys using sonar and seismic imaging have begun to map the lost landscape of Doggerland in extraordinary detail. The rivers and hills and valleys of this submerged world are becoming visible again, emerging from the silt like a photograph, developing in a dark room. One of the most remarkable discoveries in Doggerland is a site known as the Brown Bank, an area of elevated seafloor between England and the Netherlands. Here, researchers have found evidence of human occupation dating back to the Mesolithic period, around 10,000 years ago. They have recovered fragments of bone, pieces of worked flint, and even a carved piece of antler that may have been part of a tool or a weapon. The people who left these objects behind were among the last inhabitants of Doggerland. The sea was already rising around them. The end of Doggerland was slow but inexorable. As the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, the North Sea crept inland. The marshes expanded. The rivers grew wider and deeper. The low-lying areas became permanently flooded. The people retreated to higher ground, the hills that are now the Dogger Bank and other shallow areas. But the water kept rising. The hills became islands. The islands grew smaller. And eventually, around 8,000 years ago, the last of Doggerland slipped beneath the waves. What had been a homeland for thousands of years became the floor of a cold, grey sea. The people who lived there did not vanish. They moved north to what would become Scandinavia, west to Britain, south to the European mainland. Their descendants are still among us. And it is possible, tantalizing to imagine, that fragments of their story survived in oral traditions. The flooding of Doggerland was not a single, catastrophic event, but a gradual process that unfolded over generations. Grandparents would have told their grandchildren about places that no longer existed, about hunting grounds that were now fishing grounds, about hills that had become islands. Over time, those memories could have transformed into legends. Legends of a sunken land, a lost paradise, a world beneath the sea. Now let the currents carry you away from the grey waters of the North Sea, around the curve of the European continent, past the Mediterranean and through the Suez, into the warm, turquoise waters of Southeast Asia. Here, an even larger lost landscape awaits us. Sundaland is the name scientists give to the vast peninsula that extended from the Asian mainland during the last ice age. When sea levels were low, the islands of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines were not islands at all. They were the highlands of a single great landmass, nearly the size of India. The Gulf of Thailand was dry land. The Java Sea was a lowland plain. Sumatra, Java, and Borneo were connected to each other and to the Asian mainland. The great rivers of Southeast Asia, the Mekong, the Chao Phraya, the Irrawaddy, flowed across this exposed shelf, carving deep valleys that are now submerged and silted over. Sundaland was a tropical paradise. Its lowlands were covered in dense rainforest, broken by rivers and swamps and open savannas. Its hills rose gently toward the volcanic peaks that would later become the islands of Indonesia. The climate was warm and wet, moderated by the surrounding oceans. The biodiversity was staggering. Elephants and rhinoceroses and tigers, orangutans and gibbons, giant monitor lizards and crocodiles, and an abundance of fish and shellfish in the rivers and coastal waters. For humans, it was a world of plenty, and humans were there. Modern humans arrived in Southeast Asia at least 50,000 years ago, and perhaps much earlier. By the peak of the last ice age, Sundaland was one of the most densely populated regions of the prehistoric world. The people who lived there were skilled hunter-gatherers and early fisherfolk. They made tools of stone and bone and shell. They navigated the rivers in dugout canoes. They exploited the rich resources of the coastal mangroves and the inland forests. They developed complex social structures and trade networks that extended for hundreds of miles. Then the ice melted and the seas rose. The flooding of Sundaland was even more dramatic than the flooding of Doggerland. Over the course of several thousand years, sea levels in Southeast Asia rose by more than 100 meters. The lowlands were gradually inundated. The hills became islands. The Great Peninsula was fragmented into the archipelago we know today. Thousands of islands scattered across a shallow sea. The process was not always gradual. At times, the rising waters would have broken through natural barriers and flooded large areas in a matter of months or years. These events would have been catastrophic for the communities living in their path. And yet, like the people of Doggerland, the people of Sundaland did not simply disappear. They adapted. Some moved inland to higher ground that would remain above water. Others developed maritime technologies that allowed them to thrive in the new island environment. Better boats, better fishing techniques, better navigation skills. It is possible, even likely, that the flooding of Sundaland was one of the driving forces behind the Great Austronesian expansion, the migration of seafaring peoples from Southeast Asia across the Pacific and Indian Oceans, settling islands from Madagascar to Easter Island. The skills they needed to cross open ocean may have been honed in the struggle to survive the loss of their homeland. Could the flooding of Sundaland be the origin of the flood myths that are so common in world mythology? Some researchers have suggested exactly that. The drowning of a landmass the size of India over a period of thousands of years would have been the most dramatic environmental change witnessed by any human population since the end of the Ice Age. The memory of that change could have been preserved in oral traditions passed down through hundreds of generations, gradually transforming into the stories of great deluges that appear in the mythologies of cultures around the world. It is a speculative idea, but it is not implausible. The human mind is remarkably good at remembering things that matter, and the loss of a homeland matters. Beyond Doggerland and Sundaland, there are other drowned landscapes scattered across the globe. Beringia, the land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska, was a vast grassland steppe that supported mammoths and horses and the humans who hunted them. It was not a frozen wasteland, but a productive ecosystem, a corridor of life between two continents. When the ice melted, Beringia was swallowed by the Bering Sea, cutting off the Americas from Asia. But the people who had crossed it were already there, the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, spreading south and east across two continents. Off the coast of India, the continental shelf extends far beyond the present shoreline. During the Ice Age, the coast of western India was many kilometers further out to sea. Rivers flowed across the exposed shelf, and human communities lived along their banks. The city of Dwarka, mentioned in Hindu texts as the home of the god Krishna, is said to have been swallowed by the sea. Underwater archaeologists have found evidence of submerged structures off the coast of Gujarat, stone walls and platforms and anchors that date back several thousand years. Not tens of thousands of years, but old enough to show that the ancient Indians were not wrong when they spoke of cities beneath the waves. In the Mediterranean, the rising seas at the end of the Ice Age flooded coastal plains that had been home to Neolithic communities. The Adriatic Sea covers ancient river valleys. The Aegean Sea hides settlements that were built on shores that are now deep underwater. And in the Black Sea, evidence suggests that a catastrophic flood occurred around 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus and poured into what was then a freshwater lake. The flood would have been rapid and devastating, drowning settlements and forcing the survivors to flee. Some researchers have linked this event to the flood myths of the ancient Near East, the stories of Noah and Utnapishtim and Deucalion. The connection remains uncertain, but the possibility is compelling. What all these submerged landscapes have in common is that they were real. The people who lived in them were real. Their lives and their losses were real. They were not the inhabitants of a golden civilization with advanced technology and mystical wisdom. They were ordinary humans, hunter-gatherers and early farmers and coastal fishers, who faced extraordinary challenges with courage and ingenuity. They adapted to a changing world, and they passed their stories down to their children. And some of those stories may have survived to the present day, woven into the fabric of myth and legend. And so, as you drift through the quiet of the night, consider the real lost worlds beneath the sea. They are not as glamorous as Atlantis, not as mystical as Lemuria, not as grandiose as Mu, but they are true. They are the places where our ancestors lived, and they are still there, down in the cold and the darkness, waiting to be remembered. The stone tools and the bone fragments and the submerged walls are their testament. The flood myths of the world are their echoes. And when we dream of lost civilizations, we are dreaming in part of them, of the lands they loved, the homes they built, the shores they watched disappear beneath the rising waters. And time, as it always does, continued its slow, inevitable drift, while the seas rose and fell and rose again, covering and uncovering the traces of human presence on the ancient, patient earth. The sea kept its silence, and the deep waters held their memories, layer upon layer of silt and story, resting undisturbed in the quiet dark. The sea is not the only keeper of lost worlds. The land, too, can hide things. It can swallow cities and kingdoms, bury them under sand or soil or forest, erase them from memory so completely that their very existence comes to seem like a myth. And then sometimes the land gives them back. A shift in the dunes, a drought that lowers a lake, a satellite image that reveals geometric patterns invisible from the ground. The earth is full of surprises, and the stories of civilizations that vanished into the desert or the jungle are among the most haunting that we have. Let us leave the ocean now and drift over dry land. Deserts, mountains, rainforests, places where the ruins of forgotten worlds lie sleeping under the sun or the canopy. The air is different here, dry and hot, carrying the smell of dust and ancient stone. The wind moves across the sand in slow hypnotic patterns, sculpting dunes that shift and flow like waves in a sea of gold. At night, the desert is cold and clear, the stars impossibly bright, the silence so deep that you can hear your own heartbeat. This is a landscape that preserves as surely as it conceals, and it has many secrets to share. One of the most famous of those secrets is the lost city of Ubar. For centuries, Ubar was a legend, a city of immense wealth mentioned in the Quran and the Arabian Nights, a place of towers and gardens and flowing water, destroyed by a cataclysm for the sins of its people. Western explorers searched for Ubar throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. They called it the Atlantis of the Sands. They crossed the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter of the Arabian Peninsula, one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth. They found nothing but sand and stone, and the bones of those who had tried before them. And then in the 1990s, a team of researchers using satellite imagery noticed something: faint lines in the desert, traces of ancient tracks converging on a single point in southern Oman. When archaeologists excavated the site, they found a fortress and a settlement that had been a major centre of the frankincense trade thousands of years ago. The city had been built over a limestone cavern that supplied it with water, a precious resource in the desert, and then it seemed the cavern had collapsed. The city had fallen into the earth. The destruction was not divine punishment, but geological reality, but the effect was the same. Ubar was destroyed, abandoned, and swallowed by the sands. Its memory faded into legend, and the legend persisted until the tools of modern science finally brought the truth to light. The story of Ubar is not unique. Across the deserts of the world, similar stories have played out. In the Sahara, the largest hot desert on Earth, an extraordinary secret lies hidden beneath the sand. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert at all. It was a green and fertile land of lakes and rivers and grasslands, home to hippopotamuses and crocodiles and vast herds of antelope. And it was home to people, hunter-gatherers and early pastoralists who left behind rock art depicting a world that is almost impossible to imagine now. Giraffes and elephants and swimming figures, painted on cave walls that now look out over endless sand. As the climate changed and the Sahara dried out, these people were forced to move. Some went south into the Sahel and West Africa, some went east to the Nile Valley, where their descendants may have contributed to the rise of Egyptian civilization. Their former homeland became the desert we know today, a place of scorching heat and shifting dunes, one of the most challenging environments on the planet. But even in the heart of the Sahara, life continued. Trade routes crossed the desert, carrying salt and gold and slaves and ideas. Cities rose and fell around oases and along the routes, and the desert preserved them all. The Garamantes were one such civilization. They lived in what is now Libya, in the Fezzan region, and they built a sophisticated society based on underground irrigation channels called fogaras. These channels tapped into fossil water deep beneath the desert and brought it to the surface, allowing the Garamantes to cultivate crops and support cities in an environment that seemed utterly hostile to settled life. Their kingdom flourished for more than 1,000 years, from roughly 500 before the Common Era to 700 of the Common Era. They traded with Rome and Carthage. They built towns and fortresses, and then when the water ran out, their civilization collapsed. The desert reclaimed the land, and the Garamantes faded into obscurity. Their ruins are still there, stone walls and empty channels, half buried in the sand, reminders of human ingenuity and human vulnerability. Further south, in the Sahel and the savannas of West Africa, other kingdoms rose and fell and were forgotten. The Empire of Ghana, the Empire of Mali, the Empire of Songhai, these were among the richest and most powerful states of the medieval world. But their histories were preserved largely through oral tradition and the accounts of Arab travellers. The city of Timbuktu, with its famous libraries and mosques, became a symbol of lost knowledge, a place of mystery that European explorers dreamed of reaching. When they finally did, they found a town of mud brick buildings and dusty streets, far from the golden city of legend. But the legend was not entirely false. The manuscripts of Timbuktu, thousands of them, contain a wealth of scholarship and literature that is only now being fully appreciated. Across the Atlantic, in the Americas, other hidden civilizations awaited discovery. The Maya cities of the Yucatan Peninsula were swallowed by the jungle after their abandonment centuries before the Spanish arrived. The rainforest grew over the temples and palaces, hiding them so completely that when early explorers stumbled upon them, they could barely believe what they saw. Trees with trunks as wide as towers grew through the plazas. Vines covered the carved facades. The stone faces of gods and kings peered out from curtains of green. The cities were silent, except for the calls of howler monkeys and the rustle of leaves. It took generations of patient archaeology to clear the jungle and reveal the splendor beneath. And even today, new discoveries are being made. LiDAR technology, a kind of laser scanning that can see through the forest canopy, has revolutionized the archaeology of the Maya world. In recent years, LiDAR surveys have revealed thousands of previously unknown structures, pyramids, causeways, reservoirs, defensive walls. The Maya civilization was far larger and more complex than anyone had realized. The jungle had kept its secrets well, but technology is now peeling back the green curtain. The same technology has transformed our understanding of the Amazon. For centuries, the Amazon rainforest was seen as a pristine wilderness, a place where humans had always lived in small scattered bands, leaving the forest largely untouched. But recent discoveries have turned that picture upside down. Across the Amazon basin, archaeologists have found evidence of large-scale human settlement, raised fields for agriculture, networks of roads and causeways, fortified villages, and vast areas of terra preta, a dark fertile soil created by human activity over centuries. In some areas, the forest itself appears to be a kind of garden, shaped by generations of indigenous people who cultivated useful trees and plants in patterns that are still visible today. The geoglyphs of the Western Amazon are particularly striking. These are large geometric earthworks, circles, squares, lines, that can only be fully appreciated from the air. They were created by clearing the forest and digging ditches and building embankments. Some date back more than 2,000 years. Their purpose is not fully understood, ceremonial centres perhaps, or gathering places, or territorial markers. But their existence proves that complex societies thrived in the Amazon long before European contact, and they were forgotten, hidden by the relentless growth of the forest, until deforestation and aerial photography began to reveal them. In the Andes, the Inca are famous for their mountain citadels like Machu Picchu, but the Inca were just the latest in a long line of Andean civilizations, the Chavin, the Moche, the Nazca, the Tiwanaku, the Chimu, each left behind remarkable monuments. The Nazca lines, vast drawings etched into the desert floor, remain one of the great enigmas of world archaeology. The Moche built enormous adobe pyramids and created exquisite pottery and metalwork, then vanished, likely victims of a severe El Niño cycle that disrupted their agriculture and undermined their society. Tiwanaku, high in the Altiplano near Lake Titicaca, was once a city of tens of thousands, with monumental stone architecture that rivals anything in the Old World. It too declined, its fields abandoned, its stones eventually reclaimed by the harsh beauty of the high plateau. And what of North America? The continent was home to complex societies long before the arrival of Europeans. The Mississippian culture built great earthen mounds across the eastern woodlands, platform mounds for temples and elite residences, burial mounds for honored dead, ceremonial mounds arranged in patterns that spoke to the cosmos. The city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was one of the largest urban centers in the world in the 12th century, with a population that may have exceeded that of contemporary London. Its central mound, now called Monk's Mound, is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas, a terraced platform that rises 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain. From its summit, the rulers of Cahokia could survey a city of plazas and neighborhoods and satellite settlements, all connected by a network of roads and waterways. Cahokia declined before European contact, its people dispersed, its mounds abandoned to grass and trees. When French explorers arrived in the region centuries later, they found no one who could explain who had built the great earthworks or why they had been left behind. New myths arose, stories of a lost race, a vanished civilization, perhaps the ancestors of the Aztecs or the survivors of Atlantis. Only in recent decades has archaeology begun to piece together the true story of Cahokia and the Mississippian world. All these civilizations, from the Garamantes of the Sahara to the Maya of the rainforest to the mound builders of the Mississippi, share something in common with the drowned lands of Doggerland and Sundaland. They are real. They left traces that we can see and touch and study, but they also left something else, a sense of mystery, a feeling that the past is deeper and stranger than we can easily grasp. A recognition that civilizations are fragile things, subject to drought and flood and climate change and their own internal contradictions. They rise and they flourish, and then, for reasons that are often complex and multiple, they fade, The desert and the jungle are patient. They wait. They cover what humans build. They erase the boundaries and the pathways and the names. They reduce cities to rubble and rubble to dust. But they do not destroy everything. The stones remain. The potsherds remain. The traces of pollen and charcoal and human DNA in the soil remain. And the stories remain, told around fires, written in books, encoded in the myths of later peoples who looked upon ruins they could not explain and imagined lost worlds. Perhaps this is the deepest truth that all these stories reveal. Civilizations are never truly lost. They leave their mark on the world and on the generations that follow. The people of Doggerland survive in the genes of modern Europeans. The Maya survive in the millions of Maya-speaking people who still live in the Yucatan and Guatemala. The Mississippians survive in the oral traditions and cultural practices of the tribes that descended from them. The stories we tell about lost civilizations are, in a sense, stories about ourselves, about our origins, our connections to the past, our fears for the future. They remind us that we too are part of a civilization that will one day be gone, that will one day be remembered, if at all, in fragments and legends. And so the desert winds continue to blow, and the jungle continued to grow, and the ruins of forgotten cities slept on beneath the sand and the leaves and the long passage of years. Time, as it always does, moved quietly forward, carrying with it the memory of every empire that had risen and every kingdom that had fallen, while the earth slowly, patiently reclaimed what it had once given. We have travelled far together through the night, across the waters of the Atlantic, where the golden spires of Atlantis still glimmer in the imagination, through the warm mists of the Indian Ocean, where Lemuria and Kumari Kandam rest beneath the waves, across the vast Pacific, where the echoes of Mu and the memories of real voyages intertwine, over the submerged plains of Doggerland and Sundaland, where our ancestors walked and hunted and watched the sea rise, and through the deserts and jungles where cities sleep under sand and stone and leaf. Now, as the night deepens and the stars wheel slowly overhead, let us pause, let us drift in the quiet and ask a different kind of question. Not where these lost civilizations were, or when they existed, or what evidence might support or refute their stories, but why? Why do we dream of them? Why does the idea of a lost world, a golden age, a sunken continent, a vanished kingdom, hold such power over the human imagination? Why in every culture and every era do we tell stories about civilizations that are no more? The answer, if there is an answer, lies somewhere in the deepest chambers of the human heart. It lies in the way we experience time, the way we understand loss, the way we make sense of a world that is always changing and always taking away the things we love. The dream of lost civilizations is not really about the past. It is about the present. It is about the feeling, which every human being knows, that something precious has slipped away, something that we can almost remember, something that hovers just beyond the edge of consciousness, like a word on the tip of the tongue, like a face from a dream that fades upon waking. Psychologists have a name for this feeling. They call it the sense of loss for a past that never was. It is a kind of nostalgia, but not for anything we have personally experienced. It is nostalgia for something deeper, a longing for a time when the world was more whole, more meaningful, more connected to the sacred. This longing appears in the myths and religions of cultures across the globe. The Garden of Eden, the Golden Age of Hesiod, the dream time of the Australian Aborigines, the Satya Yuga of Hindu cosmology. All of them describe a time in the distant past when humans lived in harmony with nature and the gods, when there was no death or suffering or conflict, when the world was perfect and complete. And all of them describe how that time ended, through a fall, a flood, a cosmic catastrophe, a slow decline. The lost paradise became a memory, and the memory became a story, and the story became the foundation of culture. The myth of the lost civilization is a variation on this universal theme. Atlantis is a paradise destroyed. Lemuria is an Eden beneath the sea. Mu is a golden age of peace and wisdom. Even the real lost worlds, Doggerland and Sundaland and the drowned coastlines of the Ice Age, take on a kind of Edenic quality in our imaginations. We picture them as places of abundance and beauty, where life was simpler and richer, where humans lived in harmony with their environment. The archaeological record tells a more complex story, of course, a story of struggle and adaptation and hard choices, but the myth-making impulse is strong. We want to believe in paradise, and we want to believe that paradise can be lost. This is the darker side of the myth. The fall of Atlantis is not just a tragedy, it is a warning. The Atlanteans, in Plato's telling, were destroyed because they became corrupt and arrogant. They lost their virtue and their wisdom, and the gods punished them. This is a deeply satisfying narrative. It tells us that the universe is moral, that hubris has consequences, that the powerful will eventually be brought low. It is a story we tell ourselves to make sense of a world where bad things happen, to reassure ourselves that there is order beneath the chaos. The myth of the lost civilization is, in this sense, a theodicy, an explanation for why suffering exists. The great civilization fell because it deserved to fall. The lesson is clear. Do not make the same mistake. But there is another reason we dream of lost civilizations, and it is simpler and perhaps more honest. We dream of them because we're curious, because the world is full of mysteries and we want to solve them, because the past is a vast, dark ocean and we want to know what lies beneath its surface. The archaeologists who search for Atlantis, the geologists who map Doggerland, the historians who piece together the fragments of ancient texts. They are driven by the same impulse that drives a child to explore a cave or a beachcomber to search for shells. The impulse to discover, the thrill of finding something that has been hidden, the joy of bringing light into the darkness. This curiosity is one of the defining traits of our species. We are the animal that asks questions. We are the animal that wonders. We look at a flooded coastline and ask what was there before. We look at an ancient ruin and ask who built it and why. We look at the stars and ask if anyone is looking back. The myth of the lost civilization is, in part, an expression of this endless curiosity. It is a way of framing the questions that drive us forward. What lies beneath the sea? What is buried under the sand? What came before us? What will come after? And then there is the most personal reason of all. We dream of lost civilizations because we know, in some deep and quiet part of ourselves, that we too will be lost. Every individual, every family, every nation, every culture, everything that exists now will one day be gone. The cities we live in will crumble, the books we write will decay, the songs we sing will be forgotten, the names we bear will be spoken for the last time, and then fall into silence. This is not a morbid thought, it is simply the truth. And the myth of the lost civilization helps us confront that truth in a way that is bearable, even beautiful. When we tell stories about Atlantis, we are telling stories about ourselves. The golden towers sinking beneath the waves, that is us. The wise kings who became corrupt, that is us. The temples and libraries and gardens lost forever, that is us. And the story that survives, passed down through generations, transformed and embellished, but still carrying a kernel of truth. That is us too. The story is what remains. The story is what outlasts the stone, and the bronze and the gold. The story is the only true immortality. Consider the way myths evolve. They are not static. They change with each retelling, adapting to the needs and fears and hopes of the people who tell them. Plato's Atlantis was a cautionary tale about imperial overreach and moral decay. The Atlantis of the Renaissance was a symbol of lost wisdom and ancient knowledge. The Atlantis of Ignatius Donnelly was the fountainhead of all civilization. a scientific hypothesis dressed in the language of epic. The Atlantis of the Theosophists was a spiritual realm, a root race of advanced beings. The Atlantis of modern popular culture is an adventure playground, a place of crystals and energy fields and ancient astronauts. Each version of Atlantis reflects the culture that produced it. Each version tells us something about what that culture valued and feared. The same is true of Lemuria and Mu and all the other lost civilizations. The Tamil stories of Kumari Kandam are not just geological memories, they are assertions of cultural identity and pride, a way of saying that Tamil civilization is ancient and great and worthy of respect. The Pacific legends of Hiva and Hawaii are not just travelogues, they are spiritual maps, connecting the living to their ancestors and their gods. The modern search for lost civilizations, the sonar surveys and the satellite imagery, and the painstaking excavations, is not just science, it is a quest for meaning, an attempt to connect with something larger than ourselves. And in this sense, the myth of the lost civilization is not a lie, it is a truth told in the language of story. It is a way of expressing something that is hard to express in any other way, the sense that the world is old and full of wonders, that human beings have been here for a very long time, that we are part of a story that stretches back into the darkness and forward into the unknown. The lost civilization is a symbol of everything we have lost and everything we hope to find again. It is a dream we dream together, across cultures and centuries, a shared vision of a world more beautiful and more complete. And so the dream continues. Every night, somewhere in the world, someone is reading about Atlantis. Someone is looking at a map of the Pacific and wondering what lies beneath the blue. Someone is walking through a desert and imagining the cities that sleep under the sand. Someone is telling a child a story about a great flood that covered the land. The dream is ancient and it is always new. It is a river that flows through the human heart, and we are all swimming in its waters. Let yourself float now on that river. Feel the current of story carrying you gently forward. The lost civilizations are all around you, not as facts or theories or controversies, but as presences. The ghost of Atlantis glimmers in the depths. The memory of Lemuria drifts in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. The echoes of Pacific voyagers whisper across the waves. The real and the imagined, the true and the beautiful, the past and the present, all of it flows together in the great, slow river of dream. And there is no need to separate them. Not tonight. Tonight, let the stories be what they are. Let them be the dreams of our ancestors, passed down to us across thousands of years. Let them be the questions that keep us curious and humble. Let them be the mirrors in which we see our own hopes and fears reflected. The lost civilizations are not lost at all. They are here, in the quiet of this moment, in the rhythm of these words, in the gentle drift of your breath as you rest. And so the story continued, not as a search for proof or a quest for certainty, but simply as a story, told and retold, dreamed and redreamed, through all the long nights of human history. The sea kept its silence, and the dreamers kept their dreams, and the line between what was real and what was remembered grew soft and gentle in the fading light. The night is deep now. The hours have slipped by like water through quiet fingers, and we find ourselves approaching the final shores of our journey. We have wandered far together, across oceans and deserts, through myths and memories, into the heart of the human need to remember and to dream. Now, as the darkness reaches its deepest point, let us gather together all the threads we have followed. Let us hold them gently, one by one, and see what they have to teach us about the legacy of lost civilizations. What does it mean, after all, to leave a legacy? It means to leave something behind, something that continues to exist and to matter after you're gone. The lost civilizations we have explored tonight have left many kinds of legacies. Some left physical traces, stone foundations on the seafloor, potsherds in the desert, earthworks in the jungle. Some left genetic traces, the DNA of ancient populations living on in their modern descendants. Some left cultural traces, words and stories and traditions that have been passed down through hundreds of generations. And some left something even more intangible, but no less real. An idea, a vision, a dream. The legacy of Atlantis is perhaps the most powerful example of this. Whether or not a real island sank beneath the waves of the Atlantic 9,000 years before Plato, the idea of Atlantis has shaped human culture for more than 2 millennia. It has inspired explorers to set sail across unknown seas. It has inspired scholars to search for truth in ancient texts. It has inspired artists to paint visions of golden towers and marble temples. It has inspired revolutionaries to imagine better societies and reformers to warn against corruption and decay. The name Atlantis has become a shorthand for lost greatness, for vanished glory, for the fragility of even the mightiest civilizations. And that is a legacy more enduring than any stone monument. The legacy of Lemuria is different, but equally profound. It is a legacy of connection between continents, between cultures, between science and spirituality. The Tamil traditions of Kumari Kandam continue to resonate with millions of people today, shaping their sense of identity and their relationship to the past. The scientific theory of Lemuria, though disproven, contributed to the development of plate tectonics, one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century. And the occult vision of Lemuria, with its dream of a spiritual golden age, continues to offer comfort and inspiration to those who seek meaning beyond the material world. Each of these legacies is real, even if the continent they refer to is not. The legacy of the real drowned landscapes, Doggerland and Sundaland and Beringia and the rest, is perhaps the most important of all. These are not myths, they are not speculations. They are places where our ancestors lived, and their loss is a part of our shared human story. The study of these submerged worlds is transforming our understanding of prehistory. It is showing us that the past is not a static picture, but a dynamic process, shaped by climate and geology and human adaptation. It is reminding us that we are a species that has faced environmental challenges before, and that we have found ways to survive and to thrive. And it is providing a warning, a gentle, sobering reminder that the sea levels are rising again, that the coasts where we live and build and dream are not permanent, that the story of loss is not over. The legacy of the desert cities and the jungle kingdoms carries a similar message. The Garamantes ran out of water, the Maya faced drought and deforestation. The Mississippians experienced social upheaval and dispersal. These were not mysterious disappearances, but complex processes of change and adaptation. People moved, cultures transformed. New societies emerged from the old. The lesson is not that civilizations collapse because they're foolish or wicked. The lesson is that civilizations are dynamic systems, always evolving, always responding to new challenges. And the best way to honor their legacy is to learn from them, to understand what worked and what didn't, what proved resilient and what proved fragile, what was lost and what was preserved. But beyond all these practical legacies, there is a deeper gift that the lost civilizations offer us. They offer us a sense of wonder. In a world that can sometimes feel small and fully mapped and thoroughly explained, the lost civilizations remind us that mystery still exists. We do not know everything. We do not know what lies beneath the silt of the North Sea, or the sand of the Sahara, or the canopy of the Amazon. We do not know what stories were told around the campfires of Doggerland, or in the temples of the Maya, or on the voyaging canoes of the Pacific. We do not know what truths might be encoded in the myths we have inherited. The past is still full of surprises, and that is a good thing. That is a gift. The lost civilizations also offer us a sense of humility. They remind us that we are not the first complex society to walk the earth. We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are one chapter in a story that stretches back tens of thousands of years and will stretch forward, we hope, for many thousands more. The people of Atlantis, whether real or imagined, built a civilization that seemed eternal, and then it was gone. The people of Cahokia built mounds that still stand today, but their descendants do not remember their names. We are part of this same story. Our cities and our technologies and our certainties are no more permanent than theirs. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for perspective. It is an invitation to hold our own importance a little more lightly. And the lost civilizations offer us a sense of connection. Across time and space, across oceans and deserts, across the boundaries of language and culture, we are linked to the people who came before us. We share their hopes and their fears, their creativity and their vulnerability, their capacity for wonder and their need to make sense of the world. When we tell stories about Atlantis, we are joining a conversation that has been going on since Plato sat in the shade of a colonnade and wrote down the words of Critias. When we study Doggerland, we are reaching across 10,000 years to touch the lives of people who fished in rivers that no longer exist. When we listen to the Tamil poems about Kumari Kandam, we are hearing the voice of loss, the same voice that speaks in every human heart, in every age, in every language. This is the quiet legacy of Atlantis, Lemuria, and every forgotten shore. Not the legacy of proof or discovery, but the legacy of story, the story that connects us to each other and to the past, the story that helps us face the future with courage and grace, the story that sings in the darkness like a lullaby, reminding us that we are not alone. And so, as our journey draws toward its close, let yourself rest in the embrace of that story. You have travelled far tonight. You have crossed oceans and deserts. You have walked through golden cities and humble villages. You have listened to philosophers and sailors, to geologists and mystics, to the voices of those who lived long ago and the voices of those who are still searching. All of them are part of the same great chorus. We hear the human chorus, singing its endless song of wonder and loss and hope. The legacy of the lost civilizations is you. It is the listener resting in the quiet of the night, carrying the stories forward into another day. The stories will be here when you need them. They will be here when you want to wander again through the ruins of a city that never was, or dive down to the sunken plains where the mammoths once walked, or sit by a fire on a Pacific island and hear the tale of the land that sank beneath the sea. The stories are patient. They have waited for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer. For now, let them rest. Let yourself rest. The night is deep and the stars are bright, and the world is full of mysteries that do not need to be solved tonight. The sea is calm. The wind is gentle. The ruins sleep under the waves and the sand and the leaves. And the story of Atlantis and Lemuria and every lost civilization drifts quietly on the currents of time, waiting for the next dreamer to arrive. And the years moved quietly forward, as they always had, and the world continued its slow turning, and the stories of what was lost remained, soft as starlight, deep as the ocean, eternal as the human heart that dreamed them into being. The hour is late now, the deepest hour of the night, when the world holds its breath and time itself seems to slow. Most of those who began this journey are sleeping now, truly sleeping, deeply sleeping, carried by the rhythm of the words into a place beyond thought, beyond memory, beyond the need to listen. And for those few who still drift on the edge of waking, this is the quietest part of our time together. The part where the story itself begins to dissolve, like mist over water at dawn. There is nothing you need to do now, nothing you need to follow or understand. Let the words wash over you like soft waves on a shore that needs no name. Let the images rise and fall like the breath of a sleeping child. We are not traveling anymore. We have arrived. We are floating in the still center of the night, where all the lost cities and all the forgotten shores come together in a single, peaceful silence. Picture, if you can, the moonlight falling on water that is absolutely calm. Not a ripple, not a breath of wind. The sea is like a sheet of dark silk, stretching to every horizon. And just beneath the surface, visible through the clear water, are the shapes of what was once a city. You can see the outlines of walls, the grid of streets, the circles of a great plaza. The stone is pale in the moonlight, softened by centuries of immersion, covered here and there by the gentle growth of coral and the slow drift of seaweed. Fish move through the empty windows. Their scales catch the light and flash silver before fading back into shadow. There is no sadness here. The city is not a tomb, it is a garden, a place where life has returned and made something new from what was left behind. The columns that once held up a temple roof are now the pillars of an underwater grove. The marketplaces where voices once rose in commerce and argument are now quiet clearings, where the sand shifts slowly with the currents. The streets that once echoed with the footsteps of thousands are now pathways for creatures that know nothing of human history, that live entirely in the present moment, that ask no questions and seek no answers. This is the peace that comes to all things eventually, the peace of acceptance, the peace of letting go. The civilizations we have explored tonight have all found this peace, whether they existed in fact or in imagination. They have all settled into the quiet of the deep. They have all released their hold on the world of the living. They have all become part of the larger story, the story of the earth and the sea and the stars, the story that began before humans ever walked and will continue long after we are gone. Feel the depth beneath you now. The water is very deep here. Below the city, the seafloor slopes away into darkness, a darkness so complete that no light from the moon or the stars has ever reached it. And yet even there, in the cold and the silence, life exists. Creatures that glow with their own light, organisms that have adapted to pressures that would crush anything built by human hands. The deep sea is not empty. It is full of wonders that we have barely begun to understand. And the ruins of the lost civilizations, if any remain down there, are in good company. They are surrounded by miracles. Above the water, the sky is clear. The stars are bright and sharp. The Milky Way, a river of light across the darkness. There is no moon visible in this imagined sky, only stars, billions of them, stretching away into infinity. Each one is a sun. Many of them have planets, and on some of those planets, perhaps, there are oceans and continents and civilizations. Perhaps some of those civilizations have risen and fallen. Perhaps some of them are dreaming their own dreams of lost worlds. Perhaps, at this very moment, someone on a planet circling a distant star is looking up at their night sky and wondering if they are alone, and telling a story about a golden age that ended, and finding comfort in the telling. The universe is full of lost civilizations. Every star that has ever burned will one day go out. Every planet that has ever formed will one day be destroyed. Every species that has ever lived will one day be extinct. This is not a tragedy. It is the natural order of things. It is the rhythm of existence, creation and destruction, rise and fall, light and darkness, the great cycle that turns and turns and has always turned and will always turn. The lost civilizations are not exceptions to this rhythm. They are expressions of it. They are the crest of a wave that rose and broke and returned to the sea from which it came. And yet, something remains. The wave is gone, but the water endures. The city is gone, but the stone endures. The people are gone, but the story endures. This is the paradox at the heart of all our explorations tonight. Nothing lasts forever, and yet everything leaves a trace. The universe forgets nothing. Every action, every thought, every dream, all of it is recorded somewhere, somehow, in ways we cannot fully comprehend. The lost civilizations are lost only to us. In the great ledger of existence, they are still present, they are still real, they are still part of the unfolding story. Let yourself sink a little deeper into this understanding. Let it hold you the way the sea holds the ruins of the ancient city. You are not separate from the lost civilizations. You are one of them. Your life, your loves, your struggles, your dreams, all of it is part of the same great pattern. One day, the civilization you belong to will be gone. One day, everything you know will be transformed into something new. And that is all right. That is as it should be. The wave rises and falls. The water remains. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The sea breathes its eternal rhythm. The ruins sleep in the deep. And somewhere far away, a new civilization is being born. A new city is being built on the shores of a new ocean. New stories are being told around new fires. The cycle continues. The dream goes on. And so the midnight hour passes, silent and serene, while the world holds its breath and the night wraps itself around us like a blanket woven from starlight and the memory of ancient seas. The midnight hour has passed, and the night has begun its slow, almost imperceptible turn toward morning. But the dawn is still far away, and there is time yet to rest in the quiet, to linger in the space between waking and sleep, to let the last gentle currents of story carry us forward. This is the gentle shore, the place where the waves of narrative finally reach the sand, where the long journey of the night begins to settle into stillness. We have spoken of many things in these hours, of oceans and deserts, of temples and ruins, of philosophers and explorers, and the ordinary people whose names are lost, but whose lives were no less precious. We have explored the grand myths of Atlantis and Lemuria and Mu, and we have walked the real drowned landscapes of Doggerland and Sundaland. We have asked why humans dream of lost civilizations, and we have found no single answer, only the recognition that the dream itself is ancient and universal and will never end. And now, as we prepare to take our leave of these stories, let us reflect gently on what they mean for us today. We live in a time of rapid change. The seas are rising again, as they did at the end of the last ice age, though now the cause is different and the pace is faster. Coastal cities around the world are facing the possibility of inundation. Island nations are planning for a future in which their homelands may become uninhabitable. The idea of a lost civilization is not just a myth from the distant past, it is a possibility for the near future. This is a sobering thought, but it need not be a frightening one. Not in this moment, not here in the quiet of the night. Here it is simply a reminder. The stories we have told tonight are not just about what has been lost, they are about what might yet be preserved. The legacy of the lost civilizations is not only a matter of myth and memory, it is also a matter of action. The people of Doggerland and Sundaland did not simply vanish. They adapted, they moved, they found new ways to live. Their descendants are still here. And in the same way, the challenges we face today, environmental, social, political, are not a sentence of doom. They are an invitation to adapt, to innovate, to cooperate, to survive. The lost civilizations remind us that change is inevitable, but extinction is not. We can learn from the past without being trapped by it. We can honor the memory of what was lost by working to protect what remains. This is one legacy, but there is another, quieter legacy too. The legacy of wonder, the legacy of mystery, the legacy of the unanswered question and the untold story. In a world that often values certainty and speed and measurable outcomes, the lost civilizations stand as a gentle counterweight. They remind us that not everything can be known, not everything can be solved. Some things are meant to remain in shadow, to be glimpsed only from the corner of the eye, to be felt rather than analysed. The mystery of Atlantis, the ambiguity of Lemuria, the enigma of Mu. These are not failures of knowledge, they are invitations to humility. They are reminders that the universe is larger and stranger than our theories can capture, and so we carry the lost civilizations with us. Not as facts to be memorized or theories to be debated, but as companions for the quiet hours. They are there when we need them, when we want to drift away from the noise of the present and wander through the imagined streets of an ancient city. They are there when we want to feel connected to the long chain of human generations, stretching back into the darkness of prehistory and forward into an unknown future. They are there when we want to remember that we are part of something larger than ourselves, something that began long before we were born and will continue long after we are gone. Think of all the people who have contributed to the stories we have explored tonight. The Egyptian priests who spoke to Solon, if they were real. Plato, writing by lamplight in Athens. The Tamil poets who sang of Kumari Kandam. The Pacific navigators who steered by the stars. The geologists who mapped the seafloor. The archaeologists who sifted through the sand for fragments of the past. The dreamers and the mystics and the skeptics and the believers. All of them in their different ways were reaching toward the same thing. A deeper understanding of where we come from and what we are. A sense of connection to the great river of time. And now you, resting here in the quiet, are part of that same reaching. By listening to these stories, by letting them settle into your mind, you have become part of the tradition. The dream of lost civilizations is not a solitary dream. It is a collective one. It belongs to all of us. It is one of the ways we make sense of being human, and it will continue as long as there are humans to dream it. Feel the shore beneath you now. It is soft and warm, a beach of pale sand that slopes gently into calm water. The tide is out and the waves are small, just a whisper of foam at the edge of the sea. The sky still dark, but there is a faint lightness in the east, a suggestion of the dawn that will come eventually. The air is cool and clean, carrying the scent of salt and seaweed. And all along the shore, as far as the eye can see, there are fragments of the past, shells and stones, and pieces of driftwood, each one worn smooth by the sea, each one carrying a story that can never be fully told. This is the shore of memory, the shore where all lost things eventually wash up. The cities and the temples, the ships and the statues, the voices and the songs, all of them are here, in one form or another. They have been transformed by their long journey through the deep. They are no longer what they were, but they are still beautiful, still worthy of attention, still capable of stirring something in the heart that cannot be put into words. You can walk along this shore if you wish, or you can simply rest here and let the night continue its slow drift toward morning. There is no obligation, no destination to reach. The stories have been told, the journey is complete. All that remains is the peace of the present moment, the gentle sound of the waves, and the quiet knowledge that the lost civilizations are not lost at all. They are here, they have always been here, and they always will be. Time continued its slow, patient turning, and the sea whispered its endless song, and the shore received all that the waves brought. Shells and stones and stories, fragments of the past, seeds of the future, all mingling together in the quiet before the dawn. The first pale light of dawn is beginning to touch the eastern sky. It is still very faint, just a softening of the darkness, a hint of grey along the horizon. The stars have not yet faded, but they will soon. The night is almost over, and our journey together is reaching its final moments. We have travelled far, you and I, across the vast and ancient oceans, through the mists of the Indian Ocean, over the endless blue of the Pacific. We have walked through the golden streets of Atlantis and the green lowlands of Doggerland. We have listened to the priests of Egypt and the poets of Tamil Nadu, to the navigators of Polynesia and the explorers of the modern age. We have held the stories gently, without demanding that they prove themselves. We have let them be what they are, dreams, memories, possibilities, gifts, and now it is time to let them settle. to let them sink down into the quiet depths of your mind, where they can rest and be at peace. You do not need to remember every detail. You do not need to hold on to every name. The stories will be here when you need them. They will rise up again when you're ready to wander once more through the ruins and the temples and the sunken shores. For now, they can sleep. As you can sleep. The world is quiet at this hour. The birds have not yet begun to sing. The streets are still empty. The houses are dark. It is the time between night and day, the threshold between dreaming and waking. And in this threshold, everything is possible. The lost civilizations feel very close now, not as distant memories, but as presences. They're just beyond the veil of consciousness, waiting to be dreamed again. There is nothing more that needs to be said. The story has been told. The night has been spent in good company, the company of those who came before, those who wondered and searched and imagined, those who stood on ancient shores and watched the sea rise. We are connected to them. We have always been connected to them, and the connection will endure long after this night has faded into memory. So let your breathing slow a little more. Let your body sink a little deeper into the surface beneath you. The journey is complete. The waters are calm. The sky is softening with the first hints of morning light. And somewhere, far away, beneath the waves, the lost cities continue to dream.